Welcome to Old Path and our study through the New Testament book of Revelation. We are at the beginning of chapter 13, and I'll explain here in a little bit why we're going to do this, but we're going to review some even of what we looked at last week, because there's just there's information that I didn't get a chance to get to, and kind of thinking about it over the last week. I want to go back and, I guess you could say, kind of tie up some loose ends, and I'll explain why I kind of reached that conclusion based on some things that I got through email, and also some things that were on the YouTube channel, some stuff I cleaned up in the comments, because I just don't want people to be confused by this. So anyway, we'll get to that in just a moment. And very quickly, I will make mention we're after the first of the year now. I trust everybody's new year was wonderful and safe. We've had some very interesting things that took place because of events on New Year's Eve and New Year's Day. And so I'll address those here in just a moment, because as we lead into this, I'm kind of doing some topical review of things to start the services, or to start the studies. And I wanted to do one of those today. Of course, I'm going to make that kind of a normal part of the studies, is to do something on a topical line of just things that get brought up in discussion all the time. So I'll do one of those today. But before we get there, things are happening very, very quickly in the Middle East, and Israel looks to be in much better shape, really, by every week that goes by, more so than the week before. And so it's with that I want to make mention again about our trip that we have planned for March of this coming March. We're going to be leaving for Israel on the 10th of March. That's the plan. And if everything holds as it is, and the peace keeps in place, especially up in the north, where it had been that's really what had been the sticking point for months and months and months, is what was happening up in the north with Hezbollah. But that is very, very much calmed down now. And so at the current trajectory, we shouldn't have any reason why we can't get there and do so safely and get to our full itinerary. So if you're interested in a trip to Israel, and it's something that you've been kind of playing around in your mind, it is incredibly impactful to the life of the believer. If people are concerned about whether or not it's a secure thing that they could do, is it safe? I am reminded of a couple of things. First of all, I wouldn't want to go there if I felt that it was unsafe, so I wouldn't schedule a trip to go there if I really felt that there was any kind of safety concerns, more so than what's just normal. And take a look at New Orleans. And so those kinds of things that happen like that, sometimes we forget that things will happen in our own country, but because it's over there, it's always reported differently. But having been there a number of times, I've not felt uncomfortable or unsafe being in that place. So if things are as they have been before, which is the only reason we would go, then I have no reason why I would be hesitant to go myself, because I plan on coming home. And so I can answer a bunch of those questions that may arise if you want to go, and yet you have some reservations. Please contact me, and I'll be happy to go over it with you. You can do so through the ministry's website, which is oldpaththeology.net. That is the website for the ministry here in Texas. And though I come out of Old Path, now they've changed the name back to Calvary Chapel of Cyprus. We are our own entity here as far as the ministry is concerned, but we come out from among them, and so we're part of that family of ministry there in California, in Cyprus. So any correspondence, anything that you want related to the ministry here in Texas, contact me through that ministry's website, oldpaththeology.net. That's us. Now, one thing I want to address real quick, and again, I was listening to something this morning as I was prepping for this, and the discussions always come up about this. You will always find those people who try to make excuses for the actions of some. Now, I'm just saying that in a very blanket way. And in one particular one that I was looking at, it was not defending the person, but it was trying to put in context the reasons and the motivations behind the person who did what they did in New Orleans. And so, interestingly enough, it was more the person had some very traumatic things happen in his life. This was what the person was saying, and it wasn't about the ideology, and it wasn't about what they believed. And so they basically said that what he believed is no different than, as far as the concept of God, as that of the Judeo-Christian and those who would believe in the God of the Bible. So I wanted to address that really quick because it is something that comes up, and whenever there are these kinds of instances, and I'm trying to make sure I'm not going to raise up a flag, if you will, as far as the censors and whatnot with the videos. So I'm going to be careful about how I say this, but I think we all kind of understand my point to this. If we're trying to say that there's really not that much difference between the world's monotheisms and that it's really ultimately the same God, it's just how they address him and the label that they will put upon him. And so the God of the Bible is also believed to be God by other, quote, religions. And I want to make sure that we understand that could not be further from the truth if people tried. So let me just, instead of trying to do the comparison, I'll put it out there to anybody who believes that. So when we come to the God of the Bible, he is different and unique in some of the most basic possible ways that anyone could imagine. And I'll just give you a couple of examples of it. First of all, when he started to interact, if you will, with a nation, and very earnestly so, it really kind of happened not only from Abraham's time onward, but even after the time when they had come out of Egypt in their captivity. What we find there, as God reveals himself through Moses speaking to the children of Israel, if you were to take a look at Deuteronomy chapters 6 and 7, you'll find how he reacts towards the people and what he expects of them. It's direct communication with incredible amounts of detail, and it explains about why he had chosen the children of Israel to carry his name and to make him known to the world at the time. And so again, this is after the flood, and many people have just kind of, by that time, really kind of lost an understanding 2,000 years after the creation, really who the Creator God was. And so he makes covenant with Abraham, and then another 500 years, just in round figures, down the road, they're coming out of Egypt, and God is once again establishing the idea that he's going to govern a nation, and they would be governed by a series of laws and things like that. So chapter 6 and 7 deals with that. He talks about his oneness, where we get the Shema in verse 4, I believe it is, of chapter 6, that hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. And so not one of many and not many gods, he is one in person, one in composition, I guess you could say. What makes him who he is? He's one. So, without getting into a long discussion about Trinity and Father, Son, and Spirit as we think about it in the New Testament, more importantly, what we get to, just for sake of what I'm discussing now, in chapter 7, he gets to the people where he says to them, I didn't choose you among the nations because you were the greatest. In fact, you were kind of the least of the nations at the time that I chose you. But I chose you because I love you. And that's what he says, and it's so impactful because it really distinguishes him in a very, very unique way. So it means, first of all, that he has a love for people to the individual level, and his communication is directly to them, and he communicates in just such volume and detail. So giving them the law, you can do this, but you cannot do that, and codifying it, having it written down that they would have a law by which they would be governed and by which they would be disciplined, rewarded, whatever you want to say, but it is detailed. So he says that he loves them. Now, first of all, I will just flat out say, compare that to anything that anyone has ever proposed from the history of mankind, of the objects of worship that man has had all the way up to this time. I don't care. Pick your religion, pick your belief system, whatever it may be, compare it to that. I have set my love upon you. I love you on an individual level. Fast forward to the New Testament, where we have the person of Jesus, who says of himself, when he's speaking to Nicodemus in John chapter 3, when you read it, verse 16, which we all know the passage, God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten, that whoever would believe in him would not perish but have eternal life. So again, compare that to any other religion that has ever been throughout the history of mankind, and you show me where that God says, I have taken a personal interest in you and love you on a personal level to the point that I will reconcile you in a way that you cannot reconcile yourself. Even if it means the death of his son, God would not keep that from mankind, because that was the price of redemption, and he would not withhold that from man. Also, look at this, considering what Jesus has to say to the disciples when he's speaking to them in the upper room, John chapter 16. In the first 4 verses, he's trying to tell them that, things are going to come to pass and they're going to be troublesome to you. He is just hours away from being arrested, and he's going to go through his trial and his crucifixion within the day. And so he's preparing them for that. And he says to them in verse 4, I believe it is, of chapter 16, he says, now just know this, my paraphrase, the day is going to come when people will put you to death thinking that they offer to God a service. So it will be that bizarre that they would actually be able to think that this is what God would want them to do. Now, it is speaking very, very specifically at that point of the disciples, and because of their affiliation to him and their belief in him, and that's known to the religious leaders at the time, the people that are being spoken of there are the religious leaders, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, ultimately the Sanhedrin. These would be the people who would hunt down the church and look to kill them. So we're talking about, at that time, the Jewish religious leaders. And so it's not about Jews as a whole, because Jesus himself was a Jewish man, and so were his followers, and they believed in him. So it's not a blanket thing. It's just the leaders of the religion that was being that they had kind of created of their own based upon what God had given to them. They had perverted it. So again, you see that Jesus's contests that he was having constantly, as did the disciples after him. So those are the people that are being spoken of. You, the disciples, are going to be persecuted by those, the religious leaders who persecuted and ultimately killed Jesus. Ultimately, he resurrected, as we know. Those same people are going to come after you thinking that they offer God a service. But it goes to a much larger issue, and that simply being that there are those who will think that they offer to God a service. It is a mentality ultimately because they are driven by the devil himself, thinking in their religious fervor they do a righteous thing, even if it means killing others. So that is nothing new. It is happening to this day. God would never condone such a thing here in this world. He doesn't call his believers in this time to do such things. Now, people will always love to point out that he called his nation to war during the time of the coming into the land through Joshua, and even at times with the kings. But that was always warfare because the people that were coming against them wanted them gone. And so they were going to be in a place of war. But that's not what God asks of us, the believers in this day. We are not to go out on crusades and all the rest. And it is not forced compliance of belief in Jesus. It must be voluntary. To the individual, it must be voluntary. So God says, I love you, but I give you the option. You're going to either return that love and give thanks to him and accept his offer of forgiveness, or you're going to stand before him on your own merits, and you'll be judged accordingly. So the God revealed to us in the Bible, and that is Old and New Testament combined, that God tells us today that he has direct love for the individual, so much so that he would pay the ultimate price that man could be reconciled. Do yourself the favor, if you're at all in any way conflicted on this, compare every religion that man has ever concocted in his mind, and you show me where that deity will tell you that they love you on a personal level, and it not because of obedience, not because of anything else. He just loves you on a personal level and has communicated that and demonstrated it. Last thing I'll say on that, Paul tells us that very, very important passage, Romans 5:8, where he says God has demonstrated his love towards us in that while we were sinners, he died for the ungodly. So that makes him unlike any others. So if anybody's trying to tell you that that people may call God by different names, but it's still the same God, absolutely wrong. That is false. It is not true. Compare them up if you like. Prove me wrong. Now, to Revelation, our study in Revelation. I'm going to go back, and I started to mention some things, and right in the middle of the whole thing, I just thought, I am doing way too much here, and it might have been too hard to follow. Now, a lot of this will be somewhat review of what we looked at last week, but there's a couple of very key parts to this, and I didn't take much time going into chapter 17 of Revelation. So if you're to go ahead and take a look at Daniel 7, Revelation 13, and Revelation 17, it can sometimes get confusing. And so what I want to make sure is I cut out as much of the confusion as I possibly can. And it really does help us in our understanding of this particular passage. So I want to go ahead and look at the similarities and some dissimilarities between Daniel 7, Revelation 13, and Revelation 17, because they are all very, very important. And they're all related in some ways, and again, there are some dissimilarities. So let's turn, I want to start in Daniel 7 today, and we'll do some review there. We'll look at some of the passages that are there. We're going to jump to chapter 13, and we're going to go and finish off in chapter 17 and see if we can't tie up some loose ends. So let's, having turned to Daniel chapter 7, let's have a word of prayer. Father, we thank you so much for the privilege of coming before you and studying your word. We would ask, Lord, that you would give us open minds and hearts and ears of understanding, that the Holy Spirit would lead us and guide us in what can be very confusing things. But if we allow your word to speak, we pray, God, that we would be able to grasp the bits that we can know for sure. Some things are still yet to be revealed in our future. And so, Lord, help us to determine the difference between those things and rightly dividing your word. So we give to you all thanks, and we pray that you'd glorify yourself through the teaching of your word in Jesus' name. All right. So one thing that will always help, there's that idea of something being true north. There is something about this that I want to make sure that we understand. At all times, no matter how we look at this, we must come to this understanding that Israel is kind of the key to understanding all this. It doesn't make sense if we don't recognize that the focus of whether it's Daniel 7 or whether it's Revelation from 13 onward, the prize, if you will, is Israel as a whole, but Jerusalem in particular, and it has been that way for thousands of years. And that's because God had made it an issue. And so what we find in Revelation, this is the devil having the last of his time to affect the things here on earth and to draw people away to himself. So that we know. And as far as the devil is concerned, he hates all of what is humanity, but he has a specific hatred towards the people of Israel. And so when Daniel's looking at what he does, again, we look at if chapter 2 is where we start from, that helps us to understand the sequence of nations that are mentioned here. So we won't go to it, but just very briefly, this is where Nebuchadnezzar gets his vision, and it's of this figure. And the figure starts with a head of gold and then moves progressively downward and kind of lesser values of metal. And so it goes from gold to silver to bronze, to bronze, and then to iron. So these are our 4 world empires, and that's what Daniel is given as far as the interpretation, which he gives then to Nebuchadnezzar. The important part of that is he says, you are that head of gold. So that's the first in the line of these nations. Now, are those is Babylon the first nation to trouble Israel as a great world power? Of course not. Egypt was, and then it was Assyria. Now that's probably going to play in when we finally get to, I'll give the details about that when we get into chapter 17, when we study it down the road. But they are not the ones that are mentioned, because the first in the succession of the 4 world empires that Daniel deals with begins at Babylon. And if that's our starting point, then it becomes easy for us to kind of track with it. Because if it's Babylon first, we know who succeeded Babylon. We know that Babylon was conquered in a very interesting way by an inferior force known as the Medo-Persians, or we just think of them as the Persians. But there was a coalition, if you will, but led by the Persians. From that, we know who it was that conquered the Persians. It's the Greeks. That was simple. That was easy to understand. What ended up giving way from the Greeks became the Romans. Now, not that they were one out of the other, but the Romans ended up conquering what was left of the Greeks. So that part, that's easy for us to understand. That's given to us in chapter 2. So when Daniel gets his own vision, Nebuchadnezzar had the first one, Daniel 2. In Daniel 7, then Daniel is seeing something that is very much related, but we get a lot more detail. Same for world empires. The first one, of course, being the Babylonians, the lion. The second one being the Medo-Persians, the bear. The interesting one, when you study through it in chapter 7, is the third beast gives very little detail other than it says it's like a leopard, but it had 4 wings. And it's the only one that has mention of anybody but the first. And so the 4 wings, as history would record, everything that Alexander did, he did very, very quickly. So most of the reign of Greece and the things that had happened were really not as much focused around Alexander, but really the 4 generals who took his place. They're the ones who took over the entirety of the empire, and it went on for quite some time before the Romans came on. So the 4 generals that are mentioned are Cassander, Lysimachus, Ptolemy, and Seleucus. So when it comes to Ptolemy, that's Egypt and up to basically Jerusalem, and then Seleucus was above him and taking over that part into Syria and those areas. So the Greeks had reign over Israel, and clearly by the time that John's writing Revelation, it's the Romans. So notice each of those successive generations. We know that Nebuchadnezzar was the one who conquered Jerusalem, and we know that Israel was just kind of a province of the Persians who conquered the Babylonians. That's at the time when they came back and rebuilt the temple. Nehemiah, Ezra, all of that took place, ultimately giving way to the Greeks. And the Greeks had a very, very hostile portion of their history in the defilement of the temple a couple hundred years before Jesus, a little bit less than that. But a guy named Antiochus Epiphanes, he does the abomination of desolation, the first one that was a precursor to what we are still going to see future to our times. So the Greek, that was a general. Antiochus was a general and did what he did. And it's really what created an incredible rebellion against the Greeks there in Israel. But there again, the Romans became, again, after them, the oppressors of Israel. So all 4 of those nations that are mentioned there had a lot to do with Israel, and some of them in very hostile intentions. But nonetheless, they were still the ones who governed and ruled over Israel. So that being the historical part, it makes perfect sense if we're not trying to read any one particular chapter about what we're discussing all on its own, but to realize that it's all very much related. Now let's remember, as Daniel is writing these things, of the 4 nations that would be mentioned either in chapter 2 or 7 of his book, there's one that is historical and one that is currently playing out during his lifetime, that being Babylon into Persia. He lives in the captivity that's there at the time. So from the Babylonians to the Medo-Persians, he's not alive at the time of the Greeks nor of the Romans. So when he writes, he's writing about things future. Hugely, hugely important, because it sets the marker down of everything that will transpire from his time onward, 2 of which of those 4 nations he's never going to see. But when John writes, he's at the tail end of those 4. He looks back at history. He knows the Babylonians, he knows the Medo-Persians, he knows the Greeks. He's now at that point, by the time that he is gone from this planet at the end of the 1st century, Rome will have already destroyed Israel and its what was there of its governance, and it even sacked Jerusalem. So that's an amazing, amazing, serious matter that they were displaced in John's lifetime. So you can say he kind of saw it all come to pass. Now, of course, Rome existed after John's death, but Israel and Jerusalem in particular ceased to exist as he knew them. They were still there, but they were not under any kind of Jewish control. The Romans absolutely destroyed it and took it over, and it was just nothing like what it was. And it wasn't even reestablished until modern times last century. So it's with all of that backstory, I genuinely hope I have not lost any of you so far. Now, as we study through this, remembering again, the linchpin to it all, the one indispensable and immovable part of all of this prophecy is Israel and Jerusalem in particular. Why is that so important? Once the Babylonians were gone, they never came back. Same thing could be said of the Medo-Persians and of the Greeks, absolutely. And to this point in time, once Rome fell, that was the end of that. But John is now seeing something that was already laid out for him by Daniel as God gave him that vision. So Daniel sees these things. Chapter 7 of Daniel, let's get there. And this is why it has so much to do with our study today. Now, in the first of these, in verse 4, this is the first that he sees. That's the Babylonians. In verse 5, he sees the Medo-Persians. In verse 6, he sees the Greeks. And then in 7, he sees the last one. It's not likened to being an animal, but he says that they're all four beasts. Now look at what he says in verse 7. After this, in the night vision, behold, a fourth beast. Okay, beast, great. The first one, lion. Second one, bear. Third one, leopard. You would figure the fourth beast will have some characteristic of some kind of an animal. Look at what he says. It was dreadful, it was terrible, exceedingly strong. It had huge iron teeth. It was devouring, breaking into pieces, trampling the residue with its feet. It was different from the other beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. 10 horns is very, very important. Now, important in the fact that it translates into where we are in the book of Revelation, but we don't get the details about any of the individuals, only that they exist. And I'll develop that with you here in just a little bit. So notice this. Here's the important part. Verse 8, I was considering the horns, and there was another horn. It was a little one coming out from among them, before whom 3 of the first horns were plucked out by the roots, and there in this horn were eyes that were like eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking pompous words. That's why it's hugely important for us to connect these dots. The fourth beast, Rome, not a question about that. Now, out of this, there's going to come one that will come out of these 10. Now, the 10 are not identified for us. John doesn't give us that, or sorry, Daniel doesn't give us any information on that. Other than we can say, we know the kingdom, Rome, there are 10 kings that come out of it, that we can understand. They're related to Rome, no question. And there's a little one that comes out of them. Now, you would ask yourself, historically, we know who Rome is. The 10 kings, when is that all taking place? We are not absolutely sure just from that, but because we can connect the dots in the New Testament, this little horn that's speaking these blasphemous words, that's clearly speaking of the Antichrist. So that tells us that what Daniel is seeing is, first of all, in its first part, he's speaking about Rome that doesn't even exist as he writes this. But then he speaks about from this Roman, bunch of 10, there is one that's coming out of them. And of course, that means that it puts it future to our time because it's never been seen Historically, we know Rome. But one coming out that's the Antichrist, we don't know him. We've not seen him. So again, when we fast forward up to the book of Revelation, now things start to look a whole lot different to us in our understanding of it. But there's a lot more that's here. Now, if you start to read through verses 9 to 14, just very quickly, this, again, fast forwards everything that Daniel is seeing to a time future to ours. So it's really dealing with the stuff that we find in the book of Revelation, whether it's at the first part of it, when Jesus is actually tasked with doing the things that he's going to do during the tribulation, the releasing of the seals and the trumpets and the bowls, but ultimately the culmination of him coming back to the earth and putting down the devil and all those who would try to make war against him. So that's what Daniel is able to see there. It's not pertinent necessarily because we're reading the much greater expanded version of the details in the book of Revelation. We don't need to concern ourselves with that, especially today. But what we want to do in verse 15 is to recognize this. Daniel wants to know what this is about. He's locked in on that fourth beast, and it's flipping him out. Look at verse 15. I, Daniel, was grieved in my spirit within my body, and the visions of my head, they troubled me. This was really more than he could handle. Now let's remember, we should look at it this way because it's presented also going forward in the book of Revelation that yes, these successive nations, these successive world empires, they were kind of, one would absorb the others and there would be remnant of all of it that's kind of remembered throughout. So, any conquering nation didn't just conquer and leave. They took the people, sometimes the cultures would intertwine. And it's one of the ways why you can find the idolatry and the worship of the quote gods that you found in the Greeks translated over into the Romans. They just gave them different names, but much the same kinds of deities they would worship. So it just, you find that there was that kind of adopting, if you will, some of the things. So it became cumulative. You would be able to say Rome didn't conquer Babylon, but Rome conquered Greek. Greek conquered Medo-Persian. Medo-Persian conquered Babylonian. So there is this succession that is seen here, all hostile towards Israel. And that will be the case looking backward from John's perspective. So with that being said, I was troubled. I wanted to know what this was. And I came near to one of those who stood by, and I asked him the truth of this. And so he told me, and he made known to me the interpretation of these things. So here's what he finds out. These great beasts, which are four, they are four kings which arise out of the earth. So once again, we already know the starting point of that because of what is chapter 2. We should make sure that we understand that the four that are mentioned in chapter 2 are intended to be understood in the same way in chapter 7. It's a different picture that's given. One given to Nebuchadnezzar, what he saw was that figure, the head of gold on downward. Here, Daniel is given more detail. And so what he gets is, from his perspective, these are the things that you're going to see. These four beasts, and then this person that's speaking with him, obviously an angel, has this detail for him. So these are the ones which arise out of the earth. 4 in chapter 2, same 4 in chapter 7. But here's the thing to remember. These kings all have this idea of global dominance, and that's every dictator that's ever been, every kingdom that's ever conquered thought that they're going to be the end of it. We're going to have a forever kingdom. Well, it says, but the saints of the Most High, they will receive the kingdom, and they will possess the kingdom forever and ever. So it's ultimately God's world to do with what he will. He's going to end up giving dominion, and we get this in the book of Revelation. This is intended for the faithful to him, whether Old or New Testament. Once he's purged out all of the corruption and we are made perfect, then that's what's reserved for the believer. So then I wished to know the truth about this fourth beast, which was different from all of the others, exceedingly dreadful, with its teeth of iron, nails of bronze, and it devoured, broke into pieces, and trampled the residue with its feet. He's just giving more description to what's already been seen, verses 7 and 8. So, and the 10 horns that were on its head, and the other horn which came up, before which 3 fell, namely that horn which had eyes and a mouth that spoke pompous words, whose appearance was greater than his fellows. And I was watching, and the same horn was making war against the saints, prevailing against them, until the Ancient of Days came, and judgment was made in favor of the saints of the Most High, and the time came for the saints to possess the kingdom. That's pretty much everything that you see, what we've read right there, is covered in the book of Revelation. So, starting at chapter 13, war is made against the saints. And there's two different views of that. We'll get to it next week. What does that mean? Does that mean the church saints, or does that mean the saints as in the remnant of Israel, the believing remnant of Israel? We'll get to that. I think it's pretty obvious when we look at the text in context. So at that point, we know that whether we're looking at the book of Revelation or whether we're looking at Zechariah from starting at chapter 12 onward, Jesus comes back and he basically rescues the people who are being besieged at the time, the Jews that are besieged by these foreign, these other nations. He comes back as their rescuer. He comes back and conquers. Now we know that he comes back and subdues the entirety of the earth, starting at chapter 19. But that's what's being spoken of here. And so he sees these things. But this little horn is of great interest to him, speaking all the kinds of pompous words and all the rest. So let's make sure we understand, once again, the importance of this. This beast that he sees, this fourth beast, has 10 horns, and that the horns are speaking of kings or kingdoms. And from them, among them, comes one, having all this pomp and everything about him. We'll go back and review that here in just a moment in what we see in Revelation 13. So, thus he said, I'm going to give you the rest of the interpretation. You've already been given some. The fourth beast will be a fourth kingdom on the earth, which shall be different from all other kingdoms and shall devour the entirety of the earth, trample it, and break it into pieces. So future to that time, once again, when Daniel's seeing this, Rome is what's being spoken of here, and it's in the future. So that one that you saw, it cannot be seen on earth right now. And then there's also this other one that comes from it. So the 10 horns, these are kings who will arise from this kingdom. So the 10 comes from the one. That means Rome gives rise to 10 kings. And another will rise up after them, and he will be different from the first ones. He will subdue 3 of those 10. So this doesn't seem difficult for us to understand. Let's just run through it very quickly, and then we'll move on. The one kingdom, Rome, gives rise to 10 kings. One of those kings, one of those 10, is going to subdue 3 of the 10, but he himself will be different from all the rest of them. And he's going to be one who has pompous words. He's going to blaspheme. He's going to do a whole bunch of other stuff. Chapter 12 of Daniel tells us that this same one, is going to be the one that's going to commit the abomination that makes desolate. Never has it happened in history. I don't care if people want to try to make it about Nero or anyone else, or even if it's Titus that they're trying to talk about. Titus never defiled the temple. It was burnt down in 70 AD, but not an abomination that makes desolate. It got burned down, but that's not an abomination that God sees. Something of a religious nature needs to take place. We're going to study that next week as we go further into chapter 13. Now, with all of that understood, let's turn then to Revelation 13. Hopefully this is clear. Again, if it is not, contact me. I'll be happy to keep going through it until we're all settled on this. But again, it's just sometimes your eyes roll back in your head. Oh my gosh, it's 10 and 7 and, kings and kingdoms and, horns and crowns. And what does all that mean? It doesn't have to be difficult, especially if we understand it's a running narrative. Fortunately, because Daniel is what it is, it's put everything in place that we could understand that this would be something that would help us to have a mooring. It's settled in history. Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome. Settled issue. That's what Daniel sees. Easy to understand. Then he says to us 10 kings. Then there's 10 that become 7, and out of that 10 comes one who rules them all. He's responsible for the defeating of the other 3 kings. Who are they? Well, I don't believe in any way that they are historical. We can't prove that, because I believe that what Daniel is seeing when it comes to that, when he's talking about that single one, that is not historical. We don't have any place in history where that's taken place. Though some will try to say it, the preterists, the people that believe that we're already in the millennium, they do some fanciful stuff with history, but none of it fits properly. If we take the view that this will be something future, that this little horn, this Antichrist, this blasphemous person, is not yet revealed on this earth, but we do know this, that the day is coming when he will be, and he's going to be coming out of this empire, this world empire. And it fits that it would be what has been historical will once again come onto the scene in a different form. And yet this person will come out of what was that empire. So, chapter 13. Let's look at the first few verses here. So then I stood on the sand of the sea, and I saw a beast rising up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his horns there were 10 crowns, and on his head was a blasphemous name. That sounds incredibly reminiscent to what we just read in Daniel. The blasphemy, the little horn, this one that comes out. And then you see in verse 2, now the beast which I saw was like a leopard, his feet were like the feet of a bear, and his mouth was like a lion, looking backwards through time. Because remember, in Daniel's, it was lion, bear, leopard. Here he says leopard, bear, lion. So I believe it's pretty obvious that Daniel is saying, here's the succession of world history. The Babylonians, the Medo-Persians, Greeks. And here John, being part of what was happening with Rome at the time, is looking back through history saying it was the Greeks, then it was the Medo-Persians, and then it was the Babylonians. Just a reverse of which way you're looking. You're looking forward or you're looking backward. Same nations. There's really not any kind of mystery here, I don't think. So he says, the dragon gave this individual, what we would call the Antichrist, gave him his power, his throne, and great authority. And I saw on one of the heads as if it had been mortally wounded, and his deadly wound was healed, and all the world marveled and followed the beast. Now, interestingly enough, unlike what we see in Daniel, we start to find out the exploits, if you will, of this Antichrist and how he subdues the other nations, subdues the other kingdoms, and he becomes the one that comes out of them. Notice we don't get that detail here. All that we get is after all of that has taken place and he comes onto the scene. He's drawn out from among the people, and he's set in this place of this place of prominence. So it says, so they worshiped this dragon, and who gave authority to the beast, and they also worshiped the beast, asking this question, who is like him, who's able to make war with him? And it was granted him a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies, and he was given authority to continue for 42 months. So John only tells us the length of his rule, but notice John is just giving us the same detail that Daniel gave us, and from John to Daniel, 500 years before plus. So, or roughly 500 years, whatever let's just call it 500, make it round numbers. So they're both looking at the same person. They're both looking at the same era of time. Both of them are still looking at things future. But John is alive at the time that Rome is the governing nation on the planet, known world at the time, whereas Daniel's looking at something well into the future. Rome wouldn't even be here, but they're both at that point. They're still looking at something that's future to even our day of this man coming onto the scene. So it says, so he opened his mouth in blasphemy against God to blaspheme his name, his tabernacle, and those who dwell upon the earth. Now notice what we had looked at in verse 22 and 23 of chapter 7 of Daniel. That idea that this little horn is going to be able to make war. Well, that's what's being done here in verse 7. It was granted to him to make war with the saints. Go compare these two. They're right there. 21 and 22. So it was granted to him to make war against the saints and overcome them, and authority was given to him over every tribe, tongue, and nation. All who dwell upon the earth will worship him, whose names have not been written in the Lamb's book of life, or in the book of life of the Lamb, slain before the foundation of the world. So when you do a side-by-side comparison to all the details in Daniel 7 and what we got there in this particular part, the personages shouldn't be a surprise to us. The Antichrist is who he is. He comes out of that fourth beast. So people still struggle with that whole thing because they want this world empire to be something other than what was the known world, or who could govern what would have been the equivalent of Rome in its zenith, at the top of its power. But there's some things that we cannot get away from. We can't change this because it's already settled. So everything that we believe on the interpretive side of it has to fit with what Daniel says. Daniel says this: that fourth beast historically can be none other than Rome. And the one who comes out of them, this little horn, comes out of that nation. It wasn't something that's happened historically. There's got to be some form that we can understand that is reminiscent of what was that fourth beast and its power. And so some people go as far as to say it has to be Rome, that that it has to be out of Italy, and then they come up with a number of fanciful things. It doesn't have to be, though. It could be. That's fine. And that's why so many people really jumped onto the bandwagon, I among them, 30 years ago, when the ascendancy was this whole idea of the European Union. Now, 25 years or so has been in place, common currency, common borders, all of that kind of stuff. But we're finding that it's incredibly corrupt. Now, does something come out of there? It certainly can. There are enough of the industrialized world that is there in that part of the world where you could easily make this all happen again through that part of the world. So people can disagree on that, and I think that by doing so we kind of miss the point because we're not given enough of the specifics to narrow it down that much. I don't think for a moment that it's speaking about the United States. I don't believe that the 10 kingdoms are something here in the United States. I don't think it's Manhattan. I don't think it's the United Nations. I don't think it's any of that stuff. I think we're at that point looking for something, trying to make a narrative fit. It's got to be the United States. It's got to be our own wickedness, like the rest of the world's not wicked. Just stop. Let's go with what we know for sure. We know for sure from Daniel that Rome is the issue. And so Rome is where the genesis of all of this happens from, and it will also have a role-going future. So in chapter 13, we are not given the details about what this little horn does and how he subdues those other nations. We don't get that. Or these, not the nations, the kings of which he is one. Now, we get a little bit of that detail in chapter 17, and I do not want to go too far into this because I don't want to have to do the same study or have everybody tune out by the time we get to chapter 17. So here's what we get, and I'm just going to read the biggest of the details on this, but we're going to find some similarities. So before we read this, let me make sure I take a real quick moment to pause. Daniel chapter 7. Rome is the issue, one who comes out from among those kings and kingdoms that are part of that last beast, Rome. 10 come out of that. Among that 10 is one that comes out, subdues 3 of the 10, and makes himself different from all the rest. We call him the Antichrist. He's different. Chapter 13 of Revelation, we see him come onto the scene. We get nothing about how did he come to power, who did he subdue, what are those 10. We're only told that there are 10, but we don't get any of the conflict part of that. Daniel covers it. Revelation 17 covers some of it as well. And so, verse 1 of Revelation 17. Then one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came and talked with me, saying, Come, and I will show you the judgment of the great harlot who sits upon many waters, with whom the kings of the earth committed fornication. The inhabitants of the earth were drunk with the wine of her fornication. So he carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting upon a scarlet beast. So there's the woman and there's the beast, who was full of the names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns. Once again, 7 and 10, very important. We'll get to this when we're there. Now, there's going to be some some things about it that are difficult for us to really fully grasp, but I'll give you the different options. You'll see what I mean in just a moment if you're not already familiar. So this woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls, having in her hand a golden cup that was filled with the abominations and the filthiness of her fornication. And on her head was written, Mystery, comma, Babylon the Great. Oftentimes you'll hear her referred to as Mystery Babylon. It's not her name. Mystery is she's going to be revealed. To this point, nobody had really been able to figure it out. Now we're going to get the revelation of that mystery. Her name is not Mystery. Her name is Babylon the Great. And who is she? The mother of harlots and of the abominations of the earth, spiritually speaking. We'll get to all of that when we get to chapter 17. I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. That's all the stuff that's been happening to this point and in the book of Revelation. And I saw her, and when I saw her, I marveled with great amazement. But the angel said to me, why do you marvel? I will tell you the mystery of the woman and of the beast who carries her, which has these 7 heads and these 10 horns. There again, it's the 10 and the 7. Now there's going to be a wrinkle that's going to be given to us here that we will unravel when we get to chapter 17. The beast that you saw was and is not, and will ascend out of the bottomless pit. Now, this is one that has really, really troubled people. How do you figure this out? Interestingly enough, when you think about Jesus, the one who was, who is, and who is to come, once again, there's so many counterfeits in this when it comes to the dragon, the devil, and then having his antichrist and the false prophet. There's 3 that work there. As far as what we believe is Father, Son, and the Spirit, there are 3 who work in that, but anything that would be trying to purport itself to be the same thing is a cheap knockoff, but yet he will deceive the earth. When we speak about the Antichrist, the one who is empowered by the dragon himself. But interestingly enough, we first get the glimpse of the Antichrist at chapter 6. He's the first of the 4 horsemen, if you will. So he's the one who's making the peace. He's doing all those kind of things. But by chapter 13, he's being brought out from among the people. And we noticed that what we saw in Revelation 13, there was a mortal wound that had taken place. So the question would be, did that mortal wound happen somewhere between chapters 6 and when he's brought out and empowered again for the whole world to see at chapter 13? Because he's able to function as he does for 3.5 years. But he's already been involved in the very first 3.5. So this is, again, you give speculation. Whatever it was, this wound that had been healed, it was a mortal wound, and yet the world marvels at him and worships him because he's been resurrected. So when was he put to death? How did it happen? Where are those details? We're not given them. But it does seem to fit. Something happens to him after the first, after he rides out and the seals begin to be open, because he has this resurrection that takes place, which causes people to worship him. We get that at chapter 13. So that's where you can see the beast that you saw was. So if that's the case, if this fits, chapter 6, he was. We saw him there. He's been spoken about. Again, we knew his exploits from Daniel, chapter 9, verses 26 and 27. We know the things that he will do. It relates to what we see in Revelation 6. And what he does is making a covenant. So, and then of course he was, but is not. And that point is that he was gone from the scene. Something happened. And if we say, yeah, and there's also that mortal wound, is that what's being spoken of here? Is that he is not, but he will ascend. So when will he ascend? Again, this is what's being shown to him. Chapter 13, that's already taken place. This, what we're getting, is the things that happen in the entirety of the 7 years with Babylon the Great. That happens during the entirety of the tribulation. So John is giving us a 7-year view here of this woman and what she means and all the rest of it. Chapter 13 is giving us details of when the Antichrist comes onto the scene. So you can say it this way. Chapter 13 focuses very narrowly into things in the timeline. Chapter 17 says, let me go back and explain some things in big picture. So that's what we have. Gosh, I sure hope that this is making sense to everyone here. I want to be very, very careful with it. So the beast that you saw was and is not and will ascend out of the bottomless pit and go into perdition. That's what will end up being the final destination of him when he's judged, and of course he's thrown back to the bottomless pit, and ultimately he's thrown into the lake of fire. So and so it says, those who dwell on the earth will marvel, whose names are not written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, and they will see the beast that was, is not, and yet is to come. That's the stuff that we see in the first verses of chapter 13. We read them last week, and we read a little bit about them. Same guy. So the person that's being described here, as we're reading it in chapter 17, it looks back to the person that we first see come out from among the people, and the devil calls him forward. And then again, there's a little bit of debate. Is John the one standing there watching, or is he watching actually the devil? Depends on what translation you're getting of the Greek. Is it the devil who's standing on the sand and calling him out and empowering him? Let's remember, the dragon is Satan, a fallen creature. The Antichrist and the false prophet are mortals who are empowered, even possessed by the devil. So they're not the same. The devil is a fallen creation. He's a fallen angel. These are mortal men that we're studying about in chapter 13. So here's the mind and here's the wisdom. The 7 heads and the 7 mountains on which the woman sits. There are also 7 kings. Now, the translation here into English is probably unfortunate. It shouldn't say, when you see the word also there, both the King James and New King James seem to have a little bit of a conflict here in the way that it makes it seem as though it's a separate thing. What it should be is more like this. Here's the mind and wisdom. The 7 heads and the 7 mountains in which the woman sits, these are, there are 5 that have fallen. One is, and the other has not yet come. That gives you the 7. We'll get into how that's possible and what that all means. It's not pertinent to what we're studying here, because really the only thing that we're really focused on in chapter 13 is the devil who gives power and authority and the throne, the dominion, the kingdom to the Antichrist. And he's mentioned here. He's the one who has not yet come. So he will be, again, if we're in chapter 13, remember what I've said about chapter 17, the whole of the 7 years. What will happen, there will be a time when he is empowered. We're already looking at that in chapter 13. So he must continue for a short time. That's the 3.5 years that he'll be able to. We've already studied that in chapter 13. And I'll do that as a little bit of review next week when we move into the false prophet. The beast that was and is not is himself also the 8th. He's the one that comes out of that 7. Remember, what we're reading here in chapter 17 directly corresponds to what we read in Daniel chapter 7. Remember, he comes from among the 10. He subdues 3, and here we're given a little bit more detail. John would say he's one of those 10, subdues the 3, leaving 7, but he's then an entity in and of himself. John calls him the 8th. He comes out of those 7, but he makes himself unique and different and stands above all the rest. So the beast that was and is not is himself also this 8th and is of the 7, and he is going into perdition. So hopefully that all makes sense. If we take what we see in 17 here, Revelation 17 and Daniel 7, what we get is this. There are 10 kings that will come onto this earth. Eventually, they're going to come out of whatever that reworking of that 4th beast, Rome, from Daniel's perspective. Both Daniel and John agree on this. From that 4th beast is going to arise, future to our time, 10 kings. Among those 10, one's going to come out of them and is going to take over 3, leaving 7. At that point, the Antichrist becomes, of that 7, he sets himself up different from all the rest. John calls him the 8th, but John and Daniel agree. It's one person different from all the rest. Chapter 13 tells us details about him that neither of those other two chapters do, and it's this. There's first of all the dragon, the devil, and this is the man that he calls forward, the Antichrist, and empowers him, different than anyone's ever seen. We're all three chapters are talking about the same guy, the Antichrist. So the kingdom is settled, what those 10 represent being whittled down to 7 and 1 coming out of them. All three chapters agree absolutely. That's why when I see people trying to tell me that it's the United States, it's this, it's that, it's like, I'm sorry, we just don't fit. We don't fit in that narrative because there's agreement between 3 chapters. Hugely important. Daniel 7, Revelation 13, Revelation 17 are all using the same imagery. The nation, the 10 heads becoming the 7 and 1 coming out of them. All 3 agree. So we don't want to be, confusing ourselves by adding in stuff that doesn't fit. Also, you can throw in that Daniel chapter 9, starting at verse 24. All that works as well because we're told about that Antichrist figure in verses 26 and 27. So hopefully, brothers, sisters, I genuinely hope this helps clear up a little bit of stuff. So if it does not, by all means, please contact me and let me know specifically what part may still be troublesome, and let's work through it. Because it does help us to understand what has been and what will be and those future things, and just recognizing that with the amount of detail that we get from just what we've studied today, there is no way to fit any of this into historical events or persons. They just simply do not fit. The best option for us that's open is to say that we've been shown history looking backwards, but still looking forward. If we want to make sure that the Bible is absolutely perfectly accurate with no holes, we have to be able to say this still must be future. And it all fits like a glove, not difficult for us to understand. So with all that said, we're going to pick up again in chapter 13 next week. We're going to start in the false prophet. We'll do a very, very quick review of the first verses in chapter 13, but hopefully this helps clear up some things. Once again, if not, please contact me. I want to make sure that we are crystal clear as much as we can possibly be on this, and just be reminded of this. If we are not given the details where we can absolutely say this has to be the way that this fits, then just realize there are some things that God will tell us in the big picture, but the minute detail is not yet revealed. So let's not read into it and make it say something that it doesn't. There are things that God can reserve for us at a later time, or for maybe we won't even see it in our lifetimes. Actually, some of this we cannot see in our lifetimes. We will be gone from this earth before they happen. But when they roll out, we could look at it from hindsight and it would make perfect sense. We would know exactly what it was. We can know maybe the big picture, but we might not know the minute detail, but it eventually is going to be revealed. So hopefully that helps. Please join on with us for the rest of the studies through this. We're getting into a part that has so much, we're getting into a part of this section, if you will, of the book of Revelation that's so misunderstood by so many people. And again, it's because we don't look at the entirety, the whole of the text of the Bible, to inform us on what it is that we're reading in any one particular part. The Bible is the best commentary on the Bible. Let us use what is already written to help inform us. Again, can you imagine trying to read chapters 13 and 17 in Revelation if you don't have Daniel 2 and 7 and even chapter 9 to help us? It just doesn't fit. But this is God's way of saying, as he said to Daniel, go ahead and close up the book. You're done writing. And it's going to stay closed until the end of days, and John starts writing. So he gives the more detail to what Daniel had seen. They're totally, absolutely compatible. Let's make sure we understand that. Daniel gives us detail that John is giving us the further detail. God's filling in all the pieces because Jesus has come onto the scene. Now the rest of it makes sense, and he's given us the details that can be known and given us details about things future without the minutia, but it will be known eventually. Hopefully that helps. So we will pick up next week at chapter 13, and we'll look into the false prophet. See you next week.